Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to this video. My name is Amy. I share my own personal journey of liberation as a way to support our collective liberation. This is a space for those of us really seeking to embody the change we want to see in the world. And I'm really glad to have you here with me, and I am excited-ish to talk about our topic today, which is finding a new therapist. So if you've been thinking about getting therapy, if you've been thinking about maybe changing therapists, if you're wondering if therapy is something that might work for you, any of those related questions, I think there'll be something here that can help. It's been a hell of a summer, y'all. There have been a lot of ups and downs for me, a lot of deeper levels I'm getting to know myself on that I haven't really explored before fully. More choices, more losses I'm having to face, more things I'm having to let go of as I continue to go deeper and deeper on this journey. It has been a lot. I think a lot of us are maybe feeling that at this particular point in time, but for myself, I've felt it like building and building and trying to find support for how to navigate through these experiences, through these time periods of intensity can be really difficult. I recently decided to go back to therapy, and that's what I want to talk about in this video. I'm filming outside, obviously. It's a windy, warm September day, so forgive any wind noises, or I live across the street from a park, so you might hear happy children playing in the background every once and again too. Hi. You're doing great on that scooter. Bye. Neighbor child just rolled by on a little scooter and wanted to blow me a kiss. I have gone through this process of finding a therapist a number of times in my life. I feel like I've learned a thing or two. I've been applying some of those past experiences and things I've learned into this round of finding a new therapist for myself. And I wanted to share some of those lessons here because I know I needed to know that when I was younger, when I was trying to find a therapist for the first time or the second time. So I want to share some of my experience, some of my recommendations in this video for those of you who are thinking you could use some additional therapeutic support as well. I've had a lot of experiences in therapy. I work in the social work profession, so I have worked in a colleague sort of capacity with a lot of therapists. So I've been able to see and understand that side of the experience. And I also have had a number of experiences of receiving therapy, primarily individually, but I've also gone to couples therapy or couples counseling with a variety of partners. In total, I think I've worked with maybe like, oh gosh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, somewhere in like 8 to 10 therapists in total I've had at least one session with. I've done longer work with one therapist in particular. I did 2 years worth of work with a therapist, and I've also seen some therapists for months at a time and then stopped going. I've had some really great experiences in therapy. I've had a lot of really awful experiences in therapy. I've had a lot of like mediocre, somewhere in between, okay experiences in therapy. This time as I'm coming back into a new therapeutic relationship, I've changed states, so I have to totally find new providers. I am really determined to get a good match from the start. I know the type of work I want to do. I know the level of depth I need to get to. I know I need a therapist who can really meet me there in a lot of varieties. So I am applying all the lessons I've learned from especially those bad therapy experiences into this process of finding a new therapist to do some of this work with now. And as I was reflecting about this, both for myself and what I might want to share with y'all, there were 5 main things that stood out to me that I want to talk about in this process of finding a new therapist. So my first piece of advice when you are in the process of finding a new therapist is to do it before you need it. This is a tough one because usually it's some sort of crisis or some sort of struggle or experience that pushes us to go to therapy in the first place. If you've never been to therapy before, that can be really intimidating. I know I was terrified my first time stepping into therapy. I was really disconnected from my emotional experience. I didn't even know how to talk about it. And so going into a therapy space where we were going to spend an hour focusing on the thing that I was really uncomfortable talking about, that was really intimidating to me. So it took a lot to get me to the place of having to find a therapist. It did take being in a bit of a mental health crisis to get me there. And what that means if we're waiting until we're in crisis to find a therapist is we're probably going to choose the first one that's available. we're not going to be able to go through the process of carefully selecting because that takes time. We're not going to be able to communicate with a number of therapists because that takes time. If we're in crisis, our brain is not even necessarily capable of making some of those prefrontal cortex decisions. If we're in a fight-flight response, we're activating a very primitive part of our brain as opposed to those decision-making parts of our brain that live in our prefrontal cortex. So it's not a good time. Being in crisis is not a good time to make those kinds of big decisions. Being in crisis is not a good time to be trying to find help, which we know, right? Because we're in crisis already. And so then the process of trying to figure out how to get our needs met, it's a lot. And I also get it that probably a lot of us will be in crisis before we even start this process. My advice to you just is that if you know you're somebody who has these periodic mental health crises, or maybe you're in a stressful environment right now and so you know that's going to keep coming up in your reality, if you have been thinking about possibly maybe you needing a therapist to work with, I really encourage you to start taking those steps to find somebody now, so you're not having to wait until you're in crisis and so emotionally overwhelmed by that while you're trying to find help. And the second thing I want to talk about is a direct step up from that, because my second biggest piece of advice, recommendation for when you are needing to start a new therapeutic relationship, is to do your homework. So when I say do your homework in the context of finding a therapist, I mean go into the process of finding a therapist with at least a little bit of an idea of what you're looking for. And again, if we're in crisis, we're not going to have the time, we're not going to have the capacity, we're not going to have the energy to do this kind of homework. No two therapists are alike. No two therapeutic practices are exactly alike. A lot of therapists use different theories, use different approaches in a variety of different ways. And those practices, those approaches, those underlying theories that therapists might be using in their work with you may or may not be a match to what you actually need. So this stage is about figuring out a little bit of what is it that I need so I can know enough to find a therapist who's a match. This might be doing a little bit of research about different types of therapeutic approaches. That's not what I'm going to cover in this video because I'm not a clinician, I'm not a therapist, I only know about these things from a peripheral level. But what I can say is there's a few common types of therapeutic practice that I thought about in my own process of finding a therapist. I know there's CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. That is one of the most well-known and commonly used types of therapies. That is not what I want. That's honestly not what I recommend for anybody. If you have a trauma history, if you have any kind of a trauma history, CBT is focused on the brain. Traumas live in the body. CBT as a treatment approach is not going to help resolve those traumas. This is an area where I could get on a soapbox and talk about my dislike of the widespread use of CBT. Not that I feel like it can't ever be helpful. However, it is a treatment approach that works best with the working well. It is a treatment approach that works best with people who don't have a lot of trauma or marginalized experiences. Therefore, if you are a BIPOC person, if you are a queer person, if you've lived in trauma, if you've lived in poverty, if you've had some of those more intense life experiences, CBT is probably not going to be what you need. Focusing on your brain and your thoughts and your behaviors and your actions is not going to get you to the level of healing that you need to resolve the internal experiences and symptoms that come up as a result of having experienced trauma. For myself, I knew I wanted somebody who did a lot more than CBT. I knew I wanted a therapist whose primary theory was not CBT. There were two things that I was looking for that I did know that I wanted in a therapist this time around, based on my previous experiences of therapy styles like CBT or psychodynamic, more talking types of therapy. I knew that those weren't going to be what I needed for this round. Instead, I was looking for therapists who use somatic practices in their therapy work. So somatic practices are those that get us into the body, using mindfulness, using building that brain-body connection as a tool for getting deeper in touch with our experiences, being able to heal some of those more deeply held trauma wounds that we carry in our bodies. So I knew a therapist who used somatics actively in their therapy practice. That's important to me. I also knew a therapist who had experience with IFS, or internal family systems, or any kind of parts work, really. That was something that I was looking for as well. IFS, or parts work, is a therapeutic practice that looks at the different parts of ourselves, that looks at the different internal pieces of ourselves such as a child part, such as an adolescent part, such as an adult part. They're basically like chapters of us who have existed in our lifetime, but we can disconnect and we can dissociate and we can really not integrate our wholeness as a human, having lived a full life experience because of trauma, because of shame, because of guilt, because we're cutting off parts of ourselves because we don't want to look at that, or we don't know how to deal with that, or maybe my adult part believes something and my child part believes something opposite. And so I feel stuck in between. I feel confused. I don't know what I actually believe. That can create like internal chaos. That can create internal tension. So parts work, IFS, is a therapy practice that highlights that looks at the parts of ourselves that might be on different pages and allows those parts to communicate directly so we can integrate. So my adult part can share with my child part understandings and wisdom and perspectives to help that child part maybe feel better about something, or put something that happened to me when I was little in a better, more informed, more expansive, more adult framing. Again, with the purpose of helping and integrating some of those trauma pieces, with the purpose of healing those traumatized parts of ourselves, those internal parts that might be carrying self-judgment or shame. If trauma work is something you're wanting to do with a therapist, you might think about trying to find a therapist who also is trained in EMDR or brain spotting. Those are processes that involve recalling specific traumatizing events as we're working with eye movement to literally help our physical body integrate a traumatic experience. So if there's some sort of intense trauma that you went through that is pulling back flashbacks that you have a hard time getting over, if it's something in childhood that really impacted you, EMDR or brain spotting might be practices that you want to look for in a potential therapeutic relationship. So those are the kinds of questions to ask yourself in that do your homework process is, do you need specific trauma healing? Do you need like relationship skill building, like help with boundaries, help with expressing communication, help with codependency? If so, those are things to look for. Do you need support stepping deeper into your authenticity or understanding different parts of yourselves? If so, what types of therapeutic modalities and practices could help you get there? So this do your homework stage is about both doing enough research into the realm of therapy and different types of therapeutic modalities that you know in general what's the kind of match that you're looking for, and then giving yourself enough time to scroll through all the therapy profiles to find something that's a match. And you can specify that in your search. You can specify, I want therapists who are trained in this modality, or I want therapists who specialize in these particular issues. But again, the more that you know, the more that you're able to make those conscious choices and not have to rely on therapists or a computer search program or anything else to help make that match for you. So number 3, related to do your homework, is know thyself. So this is building. We're already getting there by asking some of those questions about what type of therapeutic modality might be a good fit for me. Know thyself just means that you've done enough introspection work, enough initial understanding of the patterns that you're experiencing or some of the challenges that you keep having, that you can even identify what it is that you need. And we're not going to know the solutions. We're not going to know, here's the step-by-step process that I want and need in order to help me heal whatever is happening for me. But like thinking back to my first experience in therapy, going into that therapy space, I really didn't have an understanding of what was wrong. I saw a lot of problems outside of myself, but I did not have the clarity I needed to be able to look at how problems within my own experiences, my own internal understandings, my own internal wounding that hadn't healed yet, that I hadn't even been aware of, because I went into therapy without really being able to take an internal look at what was happening for me. It was really hard for a therapist to effectively help me. A lot of our therapy was like building basic skills and communication. And if that's where you're at, then that's what you need, like that's where I was at many years ago when I first did this. That was like 10 years ago. So that was what I needed then. So maybe that's where you're at now. And if so, that's okay. Go get therapeutic support anyways. But the deeper we can have an internal relationship to ourselves already established before we're entering a therapeutic space, the more beneficial that therapy process can be for us, because we can go in and already be able to communicate and already be able to get to the root of some of that. And then the therapist can focus on helping us move out of it. An issue with therapy I see broadly is that a lot of it is focused on reliving past traumas. A lot of it is focused on digging down into those hurt parts of ourselves and exploring that hurt and feeling that hurt, which is important and necessary. But if that's all we're doing in a therapeutic space, we'll never move beyond that hurt. We'll always stay focused looking at it, looking at it, looking at at it. Whereas therapy is really our space to be able to learn new skills, to learn how to do something different, to learn how to build new relationships and create new boundaries for ourselves and create new environmental contexts and circumstances that can support us in moving out of that pain. So if we can come into therapy already having done some of that unpacking, already having done some of that internal exploration of, here's something I'm really getting hung up on. You know, it's a lot about awareness of self. It's a lot about observation of self. Here are the thought patterns I notice. Here are the times I'm being mean and cruel to myself in my internal speaking. Here are the types of relationship conflicts that really rev me up and I have a hard time not being overwhelmed in my response. Knowing those things about ourselves to be able to bring that into a therapeutic space so we don't have to spend so much of our time in therapy trying to figure out those pieces of ourselves, which really only we can see. A therapist can never see that for us. We have to be able to look inside. The better it's going to serve us in our therapeutic work. We can hit the ground running. So if you're in a place to be able to do some of that internal exploration, sort of similar to the first point of not waiting until we're in crisis, do that. And if that's not the place you're in, that's okay too. Be where you are. All right, number 4 is cast a wide net. So all these pieces are a little bit related because you want to give yourself enough time. You have to have enough time to be able to cast a wide enough net. This current process of finding a therapist, I started like a month and a half ago, actually. I did an initial round of searching. I found like 5 therapists I thought might be a fit. I sent emails to them. I had a phone call with one of them. I almost had a phone call with the second one. And none of them really felt like the right match to me at the time. None of them really felt like, oh yes, this is the person I want to work with. And so I waited. And I did another round of searching a couple weeks ago where I found a whole new group of therapists. I used different search terms. I used different parameters to try to broaden the range of therapists I was looking at. I again pulled out like 5 that seemed like possibly a good fit, sent emails to all of them, and have had follow-up conversations with 2 of them. Because the reality is we can do as much research into the type of therapeutic models that we think might be a good fit for us. We can read therapy profiles all we want. I can, match perfectly like, oh, this person does IFS. I want IFS, great, we're a match. But until I actually have the experience of interacting with and relating to that therapist, I don't really know what it's going to be like to be with them. And I have to say, even those 15-minute initial calls therapists offer, that's not enough to be able to determine whether it's a good fit either, but at least it's slightly more information than we had before. So I know in the past, I have felt guilty about having conversations with multiple therapists. It's a people-pleasing part of me. Maybe you relate to that as well. Maybe it's social anxiety for you of like, oh, I don't want to have these conversations with multiple therapists. It's vulnerable enough that I'm already doing this with one therapist. Like, why do I have to try and interview multiple therapists? So again, do what you can here. If that's just not where you're at right now, if you need to just take the first therapist that's a match, then do what you need to do. But if you're trying to really make sure that you're getting yourself a good match, if that's your priority, if you're not in crisis, if you do have the time and capacity to do this kind of searching, I really recommend it. So because 15 minutes is not a long time to have a consultation call with a therapist, I recommend thinking carefully about the types of questions you want to ask. I actually emailed some more specific direct questions I had about how do you work with this particular issue to the therapist ahead of time. And so I got an email response back to some of those questions. So I was already getting information from the therapist in our email exchange. And so then when the call came, I decided this time to start with kind of a general question of just, what would a session with you be like? Like, what are your usual typical sessions look like? So that's the conversation we had on the call, on that 15-minute call. And 15 minutes wasn't quite long enough to like dig down into that conversation. But because I already had these other pieces of information I had gotten via email, it was helpful to just have more of an open conversation with the therapist about what would it be like to show up in a session together. And by asking that to multiple therapists, then I can collect a variety of information and be able to make a more informed decision. Something that helped me manage my anxiety or the people-pleasing part of me that doesn't want to start engaging with therapists if I'm not sure that's the therapist I'm gonna choose. So this is something that helped give me permission to have different conversations with different therapists without feeling pressured to make a decision or to choose to work with that therapist. I just said up front, I said in my email, I'm talking to multiple therapists. Would you be available to have a conversation? And so that way, during the conversation, I knew that I wasn't gonna have to decide in that 15-minute call what I was gonna do. I knew the therapist knew that I was going to be talking to other therapists too, so we could have the conversation and I could say, thank you, I will let you know in a few days or a couple weeks or whatever. So that helped take some of the pressure off myself by just naming it up front. I'm going through a process of trying to find a therapist, I'm communicating with multiple therapists. Remember that the therapist does this all the time, probably all day, every day of the business week. So take some of that pressure off. You're not disappointing somebody by having a 15-minute call with them and then deciding not to work together. You get to do that. You get to take that space. You get to have that permission. And the final piece I want to name here, number 5, understand that therapists are just people. Something that really irks me in this culture is we have this sort of God complex thing that we assign to authority figures. Doctors, policemen, teachers, therapists. We're oftentimes socialized in ways that tell us not to question these people, to just take them at face value, to trust them without having to have that trust be earned, and to believe their opinion. In fact, to place their opinion above ours almost. I've seen this hurt a lot of people in my work as a social worker, personally, people I've had in my life, myself personally. I've been hurt by that mentality. So I want to really encourage you as you enter a therapeutic space to be mindful of whether that's coming up for you. Do you find yourself feeling like you need to perform? Do you find yourself feeling like your therapist's opinion of you is more important than your expression of authenticity? Do you find yourself minimizing your experience or your story, or maybe dissenting or disagreeing thoughts you have while you're in the presence of your therapist? In finding a therapy match for myself, it's been really important to find a therapist who does not have a hierarchical viewpoint of a client-therapist relationship. I want somebody who is human and who owns the mistakes they make and who don't always feel like they're right above their clients. That's really important to me because that's a value that I bring in. And so I need my therapist to have that value too. What this also means is that I am the one who's in control of my health care. I'm not going to give my power away to a therapist. I'm not going to give my power away to a doctor. Those people are tools and supports for us, but we're the ultimate deciders. We're the ultimate guiders and creators of our healing process. Nobody else can do it for us. Doctors and therapists don't know what we need better than we do. They might be able to help us choose pathways based on their professional knowledge and expertise and the information that we're sharing, but they don't know better than we do what we actually need. So my advice in this piece is to recognize that therapy is a tool, that therapists are resources to turn to. Therapists are not experts. The degrees, the letters they have, the professional accolades mean very little in terms of how it actually feels to relate to them. So listen to your gut. If you have a gut reaction that is not a match for a therapist, listen to that, honor that. If you choose to work with a therapist and further down in your work with that therapist, you're feeling like, ooh, I don't know if this is actually a match. I don't know if my needs are actually being met. It seems like you're an expert in this, but it's not actually matching what feels true or what feels internally resonant for me. Listen to those. Don't stay with a therapist that's a bad fit. Don't stay with a therapist just because they have the experience and educational training that you think you need. Listen to your gut, honor your opinion, honor your perspective, just as much as you are honoring that therapist's opinion and perspective on what might be happening for you in your experience. Recognize that you're on equal levels and approach the therapeutic relationship with that mentality. If the therapist is not available for that, if the therapist is defiant or pushes back or doesn't seem to want to meet you on that kind of a level, then that's information too. That's not a therapy match. All right, those are my words of wisdom on this warm and windy September afternoon. I hope some of this is helpful in thinking about your own process of potentially finding a new therapist. And please just pat yourself on the back for even considering this in the first place. It can be easy to go through life just on autopilot and not really unpacking some of those deeper parts of ourselves. So the fact that you're willing to show up and think about this and do this kind of work, that's huge. That's something to celebrate in and of itself. So regardless of where you're at in the therapy finding process, regardless of how long it might take you to find the therapist who's the right match for you, try to take some pride, try to give yourself a pat on the back, try to do some of that parts work for yourself to affirm and validate the child part or the hurt part or the part of you that wants or needs help. Opening a new therapeutic container with somebody can be really exciting and rewarding and fulfilling. So I want you to feel some pride. I want you to feel some of that excitement regardless of where you're at in that process. Best of luck in your searching, and I am sending you all the well wishes.